Hi again, everybody. So you've met me and you've met Georgia. So before we start, I think we'll do ladies first. Jen, if you could introduce yourself and just tell the audience why you're here.
Thank you, John. My name is Dr. Jen Unwin. I'm from the UK. I'm a clinical health psychologist over there, and I worked in the National Health Service for over 32 years, helping people with chronic conditions, chronic health conditions, some of which John was talking about, but from a psychological point of view. And then about 10 years ago, I discovered the low-carbohydrate ketogenic way of eating for myself, and it made such a massive difference to my own life. I'd had a history of up and down weight and yo-yo dieting all my life. And then I started to collaborate with my husband, who's a general practitioner in the UK. So he's a family doctor, and he'd worked in his practice for over 30 years with the same population, and he'd seen the number of diabetic patients and overweight patients just going up, and he couldn't do anything about it because none of the medications really helped. So we started a project 10 years ago, helping the patients in his practice to reverse their type 2 diabetes without drugs. And I think we probably touch on that more, so I won't say any more about that. But my other specialization is helping people with sugar and food addiction. So that's my big interest, is helping people who really struggle to limit their intake of these processed sugary foods, and how we can help them to do that so that they can reverse their diabetes, lose weight, and improve their mental health.
Thanks, Jen. Adrian.
Hi, my name is Adrian, and I am a clinical researcher. After med school, I specialized in internal medicine, and then I did postgraduate studies on the more basic science side of ketogenic metabolism. And now I work as a researcher, as an internal medicine consultant in Mexico City. And currently I'm carrying out some studies also involving trying to understand what works and also trying to understand how it works. And yeah, that's what I do. I personally don't have a close story or patient-like story myself, but I for sure have seen these metabolic therapies work in many of my loved ones. And something I would point out is that, and I typically repeat, after all my training as an internist, which lasted, well, in Mexico it lasts 4 years and 7 years of medical school, I did not see the outcomes that I started seeing within the first 6 months of starting to implement these different interventions. And it really changed the way I practice. It really changed the way I see how medicine works, not only around metabolism, but in other fields as well. And yeah, well, that's me.
Thanks, Adrian. Ignacio.
Hello. Hello, my name is Ignacio Quaranta. I'm a clinical psychiatrist. I work in Argentina. I graduated from the university, National University from Rosario in Argentina. And when I started working and I started getting face-to-face with patients, I started working in a neuroscience clinic in Argentina. And I started seeing these very frequent comorbid conditions in the patients that I would see. So I had a frequent presentations of anxiety and mood disorders in the clinic that I was working in. And when I started connecting the dots between these underlying metabolic conditions that was highly prevalent among my patient population, I started paying closer and closer attention to metabolism. At the same time, I became aware of the concept of fasting. As we heard before, the ketogenic diets were developed as a way to mimic the effect of fasting and as a way to enhance and improve our brain's metabolism. And when I started implementing it not only in myself and started seeing how my mental clarity, my focus got better, how I could sleep better, how I lost weight, many of my colleagues started asking me about it, so I became more and more interested. And for the last 10 years, I've been very interested in and focusing on the research and the practice and trying to bridge the gap that we often see between research and the clinical practice. And I've been able to switch this frequent medical nihilism that we have with these high rates of frustration in our practice, and I've been able to switch it to a more hopeful practice where I see that my patients can deprescribe medication or they can avoid medication altogether, not because medication is a bad word or there's something evil in taking medication, but it's only when if we can improve our rationale in the use of pharmacology and we can address the root cause of disease, it empowers us clinicians to provide more tools to our patients. So that's one of the aspects that got me here today. So I am glad to be here.
Thanks, Ignacio. So I'm going to jump around in the questions and in the theme of the questions that I ask. The panel discussion is meant to focus on depression and anxiety, but I think there are other really interesting things as well to look at. But before we kind of look at specifics, I want to ask Georgia. So this group and others, and some have left already, spent a week now, a very intense week. So 3 or 4 hour intensive workshop meetings in the morning, followed by afternoons and early evenings of recording videos and content. And Georgia, how have you felt the week has gone in terms of creating this curriculum for the postgrad course?
It's been a really wonderful experience for all of us to come together from different disciplines and different countries to create together the world's first structured, comprehensive curriculum in ketogenic metabolic therapies for a variety of common conditions. That's never been done before. So right now, if a practitioner is interested in learning about ketogenic diets, they can watch video lectures from different conferences. They can put together, sort of a mishmash of information for themselves, but currently there is nowhere for them to go if they want to learn from A to Z the science and the clinical applications of these therapies. So I'm really proud of what we've been able to accomplish, and it has been, I think we've accomplished a lot more this week than I had expected.
It's been really intense as somebody who's been there. Jen, you run courses and you've taught a lot of people. You were quite instrumental in setting up or helping to drive what these in-person weekends are going to look like, where we have patients, we have doctors, we have dietitians, we have mentors. Can you tell the audience how you feel about the structure and if it meets everybody's needs? Is it more for the patients, more for the doctors? Is it well balanced?
Yeah, it's quite the complicated carry-on to try and integrate over a few days people who are trying to learn, the practitioners, the mentors, and the doctors, and the dietitians, and the nurses, and the patients themselves, and what everybody needs. But I was really struck by when we went through that, how much commonality there could be and how many shared sessions we could have, people learning together. And I think in a way that's one of the strengths of these approaches that Georgia mentioned when she was speaking, and certainly we found in working with the patients with diabetes that it's a different kind of relationship between the practitioner and the patient, because you're collaborating. Of course, the patient really has to do all the work, but you're trying to encourage them and find their motivation and finding what works best for them and individualizing it, because there's no one diet that suits everybody or one approach that suits everybody. So you've got to tailor it to the person. So I think what will be fantastic about when we do those events will be all working together, the patients and the practitioners, and trying to individualize what we're doing for each person and learning together.
Thanks very much. Adrian, during that conversation that Georgia had earlier, she described how in her medical training and then her psychiatric training, there were maybe 2 hours of nutrition education. I know when I studied medicine in the 90s in South Africa, there was nothing. And I'm sure Ignacio and you would also agree with that. So my question kind of is, do you think that the 100 hours of information that we're giving the doctors includes basic enough stuff, considering they're coming from a point where they've been taught nothing?
I think it's enough to give health workers and health practitioners enough context to keep going and learn on themselves. And I think perhaps this is enough. I remember years ago, a group of students and I were complaining about we had to learn the full microbiology course in 6 months. And we were just saying, this is just too much. This should be a 1-year course, and we wanted to have more extra lectures. And the reply the university gave to us was like, well, okay, we get it. This is true for all medical knowledge. This is constantly changing. The purpose of the course is to give you enough context so you keep learning yourself. And you could say that you could always need more hours for lectures, and you could always expand any lecture series or any material. But I am confident that the content that we've planned so far, and most of it is already recorded, should be more than enough for any health practitioner to keep reading what's being published every week and to keep learning, and to, more than that, have enough information to tell what's good quality research, what's answering relevant questions, what is not so much, and transmit, perhaps the most important part is to have enough context to answer the most common questions patients will pose, and at the same time translate emerging knowledge that, of course, we cannot do videos on yet, to their individual patients' needs. So I think it will never be perfect, it will always be updating, but I think I'm confident it's enough for allowing healthcare workers to keep learning on themselves, which is way more than the average clinician have in their academic teaching.
Yeah, it's very exciting that it's going to be updated and continually be updated, because we heard also today about these new studies that are being done in all kinds of fields, including oncology, including inflammatory and autoimmune diseases, including psychiatry. And as these studies get updated and the evidence gets stronger, the material will be updated. Ignacio, I want to ask you a question. On the great movie we saw from the Charlie Foundation, a neurologist or pediatrician or pediatric neurologist who was looking after Charlie, when asked why he didn't use the ketogenic diet, the reason he gave was, well, we just don't know how it works. As that's an excuse, right? And that made me think of two things. We often prescribe drugs where we do not know chemically why it works. It's just an RCT has shown it to work, but we don't actually understand why it works. So to me, that's a really weak excuse. That's the first point. But the question to you is, that movie was made quite a few years ago, and in the conference in Burghausen, we heard a lot of biochemistry, really deep biochemistry, experts around the world who really know their thing. Are we beginning to understand why the ketogenic diet is working for things like epilepsy or anxiety or depression?
Well, that's a great question, because even though science has advanced quite a lot, and it really has been able to establish a theoretical explanation of how the ketogenic diet works, I like to say that the benefits that we often see with ketogenic diet are multifaceted. There are many things that could be helping our brain health and our overall health. As Georgia was saying in her marvelous presentation at the beginning, whatever helps our general metabolism also is expected to affect our brain health. I think that one of the most evidence-based data that is helping us understand why we recover, a lot of patients refer that they wake up after, they cognitively wake up after a few weeks of being in the diet, is because of the rescue. There's a rescue of the energetic matrix of the brain. What this means is that there might be an energy crisis in the brain because of the insulin resistance at the blood-brain barrier. So when this happens, there's a lot of glucose, because glucose is in the brain, in fact, can come across the blood-brain barrier, but insulin doesn't. So when there's insulin resistance in the brain, that's one of the main explanations why we start seeing this energetic crisis that we might often see as inattentiveness, as inability to focus, or this it could generate these mood swings because of when our body senses this energetic crisis, might grab your behavior to eat compulsively, and this is very often seen in the clinical practice. It's hard to measure, in fact. It's very hard to measure, and what's hard to measure in medicine, it's sometimes discarded as ineffective. But there are also other aspects like neuroinflammation, like the stabilization of oxidative stress. That's more at the cellular level. There's also an improved neurotransmitter balance, specifically between the most prevalent or the most abundant neurotransmitters in the brain, like GABA and glutamate, that could be referred as the accelerated neurotransmitter and the chill neurotransmitters, and those get into a more balanced state, and that's also one of the hypotheses of why this metabolism works. That's why I try to emphasize that the ketogenic diet encompasses a lot more things than just a diet, and these are ways to enhance ketogenic pathways, and that's why most of the clinicians that work with ketogenic diets also make a huge deal of effort in emphasizing good sleep, movement, contact with nature, good relationships, and the ability to calm yourself down at stressful moments. And those things are big things in this moment, and I think that ketogenic pathways are encompassing all of these aspects. So those are some of the pathways that are seen.
So we know a lot more than we did 25 years ago, it seems.
Yes, we do.
That's great. Georgia, you gave some great examples, particularly of people with depression. Can you give us some examples of anxiety, where people kind of with long-standing anxiety manage to improve their symptoms or reduce their medication or improve their sleep because of this diet?
Yes, so anxiety is one of it's of course very common. Most people know what it feels like to have anxiety, but as a psychiatrist, I see people with intense anxiety that is excessive. It's too much, more than you would expect for the situation. So I'll give you an excellent example from my practice. A man who had been experiencing, he had depression and anxiety all his life. That had always been a problem, and he'd gone to a specialty clinic where he had special brain scans and lots of a big comprehensive evaluation, and they told him that one of the things that was wrong was that he had anxiety. They told him he also had depression and that he also had attention problems, attention deficit. And so they diagnosed him with these 3 conditions, including intense anxiety, and they gave him 3 prescriptions, 3 new medications. And he took these medications and he became manic. So if you remember from Maria's presentation, very high, uncomfortable state of high energy. And this was very disruptive to his life, and it nearly ruined his marriage and nearly ruined his career. So he stopped the medications and decided that he was going to manage the anxiety and depression with intense exercise only, because he didn't know anything about diet at that point. This was many years ago. So the exercise did help. I mean, exercise does improve metabolic health, and it did reduce his anxiety and depression to a certain extent, and it was allowed him to function, but it was always still there, you know, kind of in the background waiting. And then a little later in his life, a few years ago, something stressful happened at work, and the anxiety shot up, and he became extremely anxious, very restless, couldn't sleep, had lots of physical agitation, and so he contacted me for a consult. He looked on, he did a Google search about how to help anxiety without medication, because he really was terrified to go back on medication because of what had happened years before. So he contacted me, and he said that he wanted to try a ketogenic diet. So we did. We started a ketogenic diet, and within 10 days or so, the anxiety was much lower, and the depression was much lower. And within 2 weeks, he no longer had any symptoms of depression or anxiety. And at 6 weeks, he continued. I had given him this scale to say, how strong is your depression? How strong is your anxiety? At the beginning, it was very high, and within 6 weeks, zero anxiety, zero depression. So, and he continues even to this day. This was maybe 3 years ago, completely no symptoms at all. This is no medication. And so what he said, which was so important, is that it's not just that the anxiety and depression were lower, it's that he felt better than he had ever felt in his entire life. So, and this is, you don't hear that when people take medications. When people take medications, they say, oh, there's some relief, it's a little bit better, I can go to work. You don't hear, oh, I feel fantastic, I feel better than I've ever felt in my entire life. Because what you're doing with diet is you're improving brain health. You're not just squashing symptoms or trying to cover them up. You're actually improving brain health from the inside out. And so he feels completely well. Even now, I think it's been 2.5 years.
That's amazing. Are there any studies out there where they're beginning to look at anxiety?
I believe there are. Dr. Sotomota?
Yes, currently we're still carrying on with a study that's randomizing, because for some strange reason, medicine decided years ago that everything has to be randomized. The usual diet without medication changes for anxiety, with a ketogenic diet without medications for anxiety. And we are almost halfway there. Hopefully we can share results soon enough. But something I would add on that is that there are multiple independent pieces of evidence that point towards the same direction. And the benefits on different anxiety models have been shown by animal studies with many different strategies that, or interventions that raise blood ketone bodies. And even if a diet intervention wouldn't work for all of them, it certainly works for lots of them, which is much more than what most medications can say for any disease. So it doesn't need to be 100% successful to be very successful or to be worth trying. And also something that many medications cannot say is that the safety profile, the adverse effect profile of a diet intervention, of this diet intervention, is no way similar to what you would find for most medications, especially for anxiety. So it's something that we are learning how it works, how to prescribe, what are the best follow-up strategies, and yes, other colleagues and I think it's fair to say that the medical community is starting to turn our heads to these, I would say novel, but they're not novel, they are century-old interventions. And sure, evidence is starting to emerge. And actually, to add on a little bit of Ignacio's reply, there is this classical study by the BMJ, it's more than a decade long, that more or less says that any clinician that believes that all prescriptions need to be based on a randomized control trial with a systematic review or whatever the research standards are for their time, needs to remember that we do not have such studies randomizing people jumping out of a plane with or without a parachute, because it's obvious. And you could say that what really works actually will never have a randomized control trial. Because of the way health workers learn and think, we're doing them. But perhaps if you know someone or you have a loved one, as I have had, who is struggling with these diseases, perhaps you don't want to wait 2 years for a bunch of nerds to finish their study and a bunch of other nerds to translate those results into a clinical recommendation. You can be assured that perhaps it's worth trying because it's a safe intervention that with adequate follow-up, which already exists, can bring lots of benefits. And that's it.
Thank you. Jen, I want to kind of, I guess, tackle something. During the Charlie video, the commentary around what the children were eating, high levels of fat that they were told not to, and the ketogenic metabolic therapies that we're talking about, there may be a perception that we are recommending, or that ketogenic metabolic therapies recommend a nutritional pattern that is obscure or strange or different or wrong or do you know what I mean? It's like, hang on, if they're going to eat like the kids do, then that's quite far removed from what is natural. And you, of course, have been to a lot of courses and conferences and given talks on this. So maybe you can just share with the audience how the ketogenic diet, or what one eats on a ketogenic diet, is in fact probably the closest to what is natural in terms of our evolution.
This is a topic that I really like, the idea of looking back to what we ate when we evolved, and it certainly wasn't donuts and spaghetti, was it? Because there were no corner shops where we could go and buy those things, and we weren't farmers, in terms of the sort of millions of years ago, and how long it takes us for us to change our genetics and to adapt to a situation. So, when we evolved, we ate the things that we could hunt and fish and, pick off a tree, and those things didn't look like the things we could pick off trees and grow out of the ground. Don't look even like the vegetables and fruits that we can buy in the supermarkets today, in terms of they're bred today to have this high sugar content. So I love the idea of thinking what would we have historically eaten, and David and I often use that when we're talking to patients, because of course what we're asking people to do is a little bit countercultural. We're asking them to remove as much as they can from the diet the ultra-processed foods, the grains and the sugars, which I know I was eating a lot of, and many of us are recommended to eat in the standard guidelines. So when we work with our patients who are just normal folk walking around a northern town in the UK, we have to have a way to explain why we're asking them to do that. And you've heard some of the sort of science, and we try and put that in a very understandable way for people. We explain about when you eat sugar, it raises your insulin because your blood doesn't like to have sugar in it. It's essentially a sort of poison, and it's damaging your bloodstream. So your body releases insulin to remove the sugar from your bloodstream. And where does it put it? Largely in your liver or in your fat cells. It tries to store it away, and that the more we eat those foods that are causing that reaction, and we don't use up that energy, this is sort of leading us to have problems like pre-diabetes, diabetes, and the other things that we've heard about. So I think once people understand that simple idea, then they can see, well, it makes sense to try and start lowering, slowly removing the things that are raising your blood sugar. And that doesn't have to be a sort of overnight process. It can be a slow process where people are learning what's raising their blood sugar, or they're slowly making changes in their diets. Not everybody has to go all the way to the sort of very medical end of things, like the children were needed to in the film. Everybody has their own. We were saying about it being very individual. Everybody has their own correct sort of threshold at which their body works well, and that for us, working with patients with diabetes and other conditions is a whole range. And the fact is that people have to learn what's right for them.
So I'd like to pivot there and quickly just talk about diabetes. So diabetes, type 2 diabetes, is considered chronic and progressive, and you've got to take medications forever. That's what I was taught. That's what I think everyone on stage was taught. But hey, turns out that was wrong, because if you change your diet, you can put it in remission, and you can go off your medications, and your blood glucose can be entirely normal. And Jen's husband, David Unwin, is a GP in the UK and has published quite a bit on this, and is really considered one of the top examples of how you can put diabetes in remission. Do you want to just give one example maybe or a couple of examples of what you find in your practice? Because I think David has, about half the diabetics decide to go on this metabolic, I guess, pathway to improve their metabolic health through what they eat. And of those about half go off medications entirely, right?
So of all the patients with type 2 diabetes that choose to follow this low carbohydrate way of eating, half of them will put their diabetes into remission. It means they come down below the level at which they're considered to be diabetic without medication. And the other half, it's not that they get worse or, it goes badly. They all have improvements. It's just that they don't always come down right below that line of remission. So they may stay on some medications like metformin, for example.
And is it just their blood glucose and medication that improves?
So the papers that have been written up are on blood pressure improvements coming alongside, renal function, so this is your kidney function improving alongside, and also I think it was John that mentioned about the bad fats in our blood, triglycerides, are significantly improving as well. So there's papers on weight as well, significantly improving. Yeah. So
about 5 NCDs, really.
Yeah, so there's really, up to now, all the different health markers that you can look at, everything is going in the right direction. And this is a project that's been going on for 10 years now, because of course initially when we started, people said to us, well, you know, the fat in people's bloods will get worse, or maybe their kidney function will get worse, or so we measured all of those things to show that that didn't happen. And then you asked for an example, I think. Shall I give you an example? There's so many, but there's one guy who we started with 10 years ago, Chris, and his case is written up in the British Medical Journal as a case report. And he came, he was extremely overweight, very, very tired, struggling to work. He had pain in his knees. I think he was on about 6 medications for blood pressure and diabetes, and antidepressants as well. So he was a sort of typical case of very poor metabolic health. He was a really unhappy guy. And he came to the first groups that we ran, and he's still going strong now. He lost, I think, about 5 or 6 stone in weight. I don't know what that would be in kilograms. Somebody can convert it. 14 kilograms, yeah. 5 times 14. He's come off all his medication, including his antidepressants. He's an incredibly energetic guy. He goes to the gym now, and he helps us to help the other patients. He always comes to our support groups. He brings his fat photos and tells everyone how it's just transformed his quality of life, because he no longer has knee pain. He feels energetic. He doesn't take medications. He feels like a young guy. So if you want to see the details, I can certainly show you the open access paper. We can find the link for that.
Thank you. So I would like to open it up to the audience. Is there anyone that has any question or would like to ask these experts a question? Oh, hang on, a mic will be brought to you. Und Frage auch auf Deutsch.
I can try it in English. As a gynecologist, I'm seeing a lot of women who go through phases in their lives where they have major hormonal changes, like in puberty, pregnancy, menopause, that often come along with significant psychiatric symptoms like depression and anxiety. Is there any indication that maybe the hormonal changes trigger some sort of metabolic changes that could be the reason for that, and vice versa? Could a diet then therefore maybe the treatment, or something that we could use prophylactically or as an accompanying measure to help these women over those periods?
Okay, that's a fantastic question. What we now understand, we don't have any good studies yet of particularly focusing on women and hormonal health and ketogenic diets, with the exception of a condition called polycystic ovarian syndrome. So we know that that is very strongly linked to insulin resistance, and so and is a very common cause of infertility. So we know that women who go on a ketogenic diet can reverse polycystic ovarian syndrome and can become pregnant. And so why might that be? Because insulin is, so all of these problems that we're talking about are diseases of high insulin levels. And insulin is not just a hormone that regulates blood sugar. It's not just something that, takes sugar out of the blood. It's a master growth hormone, and it regulates the behavior and levels of many, many other hormones in the body, including the reproductive hormones. And so estrogen and insulin talk to each other, and they can raise each other's levels. And what we see, and I see all the time in women in my practice who they get, for example, cyclical mood problems, depression towards the end of their cycle, for example, all of that smooths out on a ketogenic diet. And so we need studies to show that this happens, but I think everyone here has seen this in their patient population. It's one of the side benefits of a ketogenic diet is that when you normalize glucose and insulin levels, you also help restore natural rhythms of the rest of the hormones or many other hormones in the body, if that helps to answer the question. Okay, good.
Perhaps the thing I would add is that women are privileged or protected precisely by some of their hormones during their fertile years, which of course you could say that this protection is sort of gone after menopause. So it's, and well, most of the science, particularly in the second half of the 20th century, that addressed hormonal changes in women during and after menopause, showed or considered, that all these emotional or mood changes were a direct consequence of the hormonal changes. And that's a very big rabbit hole that has its own research problems. But something I would say is that sugar is known to disrupt all these balances, not only for insulin, but for any other hormone. And as Georgia was saying, I think it's, even if mood changes are not a direct consequence of hormonal changes, they are certainly worsened by the imbalances that we know are caused by metabolic dysregulation. So it could be, even if it's not a direct consequence, it's certainly linked. And there is sound or solid biological rationale to suggest this could work or this could be improved.
Any other questions from the audience?
They can always chat to us, can't they, while
They could, yes, afterwards. Absolutely. So feel free to chat to us and approach us. Josephina, would you like to? I just want to thank the panel very much. That was very interesting. Thank you.